What's going on, guys? Welcome to In the Zone. I'm your host, Garrison Roy, and today we're going to have an awesome full-length interview. But if you're new to the show, we do have mental minutes, which are quick mental game hacks that help you stay in the zone, some deep dive educational explorations where we get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty on certain things, and then also the rants, where I just kind of go on about several things that I see either in the baseball industry or the strength and conditioning realm or anything that I see come across my social media feed typically is what kind of starts that off. But if you have any questions, topics, or future guests that you want to see on, please email that in or hit us up in any of the socials in the zone podcast 123 at gmail.com. Because we don't do ads or sponsorships or monetize the show in any way. It's more of a word of mouth and value exchange. So please share the show if you guys get any value whatsoever. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Kyle Jacksic. He is the director of athletic performance at Charlotte Christian. Just recently moved into that role, but he's been doing a lot of really great things. Glad that we recently connected. But Kyle, what's going on?
How are you? Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. We finally got some breath of fresh air for you during spring break to kind of recoup and recover yourself, right? And having to deal with all the teams that you're coaching.
Yeah, for sure. It's nice to take a step back and just spend some time at home, catch up on some yard work now that the weather's getting nicer too. So hopefully make my life easier as we move deeper into the spring here.
Oh, no doubt. Well, and then even, you know, with a good sports program just in general that Charlotte Christian has, like, and you're coming into that and developing just athletes as a whole, a lot of high schools don't have someone as high a caliber as your expertise, which I think is awesome. And you're able to kind of break things down and, say, hey, like, this is what helps you kind of perform better as just an overall athlete or all overall development as a human, regardless of whatever sport they play, right?
Yeah, I think just and like really like the nature that we take at Charlotte Christian is like we want to coach the complete athlete completely. So like having like no stone left unturned from a weight room programming standpoint to a field, whether it's speed training, performance training, what speed and agility stuff, whatever we want to do, a conditioning standpoint, how can we bring in the nutrition side of stuff? How can we teach our kids to sleep better and everything else, which I think Charlotte Christian is unique that I'm there full time 12 months out of the year, that there's constant conversation that we're able to have with our student athletes from what they're eating, how are they sleeping. Like I know when it's a test heavy week, like I'm not really blind to anything because I see our kids so often, and it is a little bit smaller of a school, especially compared to the high school that I'm coming from in Ardrey Kell High School down in Charlotte as well. So I'm able to train the complete athlete completely, as well as like we have a lot of multi-sport athletes. So making sure that I have some level of longitudinal development because a lot of our sport teams are going to share athletes on a consistent basis. So what can I do from a programming standpoint to always be kind of like moving the needle forward for our kids, taking them from, I mean, we'll see kids as young as sixth graders, hopefully here soon, and then where can they go in 7 years by the time that they're a senior in high school, which I think is really important and really unique and something like I've been working towards. It's been less than 2 months since I took over at Charlotte Christian, and it's been interesting to kind of learn how to adapt myself and my programming as well as move the school, move towards the future and what we're trying to accomplish.
Oh yeah, and I think just even starting at an earlier age like that, like you said, sixth grade's so crucial because you're trying to basically lay a foundation of more of a global movement patterns and getting them to be able to do certain things that, quite frankly, like these generations coming up are kind of losing because they're not spending as much time outside playing around and doing whatever they did best or what we did as kids, right? Like going around playing wiffle ball or two-hand touch football, things that, just maybe simply is like, hey, like go outside and play. Sometimes that's kind of missed, and we have to kind of fill the gap there for some of these kids in certain ways too. But I like what you said on the testing because I think sometimes me as a remote guy working with certain athletes in the baseball industry, I don't really get to see a lot of what's going on, but I just like encourage the communication portion to be like, hey, like, let me know what's happening. But whenever you have like 4 or 5 tests right before spring break or something like that, right? Like, it's like, all right, these guys probably aren't mentally ready to take on some high strain.
Yeah. I mean, it's been researched in the past that injury rates go up, specifically in like the months of December in college kids because that's like the peak midterm final time. So like we even lucked out. Like recently was that our kids went away for a week, they came back, and then during that week they were not allowed to have any tests. So I was like, all right, perfect. Like that's going to be the time that we all start a new phase, especially for our in-season kids, where we can always be cautious and like, okay, how much new stuff can we really throw at them? So if I already knew that their nervous systems were going to be fried because they were heavy in testing, then that may not be a good time. But when I saw that, like from the communication standpoint, from the administration of the school saying, hey, you cannot have a test this week, then I was like, perfect. Like I'm going to start everyone on a new phase. Everyone's on the same timeline. That way we can all kind of like get on the same page. And I'm kind of like learning the testing schedule. What's nice now is that I have access to that. So the teachers actually have to put in because the school's trying to take care of the kids from that standpoint as well. That hey, this isn't going to be a week that we're going to load up. Like there's never a time that a high school kid or an upper school kid is what we consider them should have 4 tests in one day. It should be more spread out, give the kid a balance of life. So it's taking a new dynamic to my program because now I'm really getting into the mental side of stuff, the nervous system side of stuff, and can kind of tinker with it and plan a little bit more accordingly because the hammer came down. Hey, no tests this week. I'm like, all right, perfect. I'm gonna throw them into a new phase so they can
Physical,
kind of learn it that
yeah,
way. And yeah,
sure.
in 2 weeks we're all systems go again.
Yeah. Well, what's some of the things like obviously really popular in the strength conditioning world is like jump testing or maybe like a grip strength dynamometer. Like, what other things have you seen of research that can also be indicative of, hey, this guy's maybe primed to do something really strenuous, or maybe, hey, that he's down a little bit, um, based on a certain test that you've seen? What have you kind of researched?
Yeah, so like a lot of the readiness scoring that we've done currently and in the past has loosely revolved around the 10-5 pogo test. So testing the reactive strength index, where it's a quick 10-second ish test. They can do kind of a couple sets of them. Then if I kind of do balance that off of from a standard deviation standpoint, the output sports monitors that we have allow us to do that. If we're taking that test number and we're seeing, hey, it's 20% outside of their regular kind of range, standard deviation of their last 10 tests, then all right, what's the conversation got to have? It's not really, I'm not married to it. I am working with high school kids because they are relatively malleable and adaptable too. I'm dealing with Toyota Camrys and not Ferraris for the most part. Every once in a while, I get a Ferrari that needs a little bit more tinkering. But it's basically saying, like, as me as a performance coach, hey, this kid's in the red, for example,
Mhm.
where red is bad. If we look at a stoplight system, red is stop. Okay, what's going on in this kid's life? Did their boyfriend or girlfriend just break up with them? Did they have a lot of tests in school this week? Hey, they haven't been sleeping well, or hey, they're not recovering well, or practice has been really long. It allows us to have constructive conversations, and then in turn gives our kids a voice within their own program. So the RSI test does a really good job with that. Philosophy training that we're saying like, hey, like we're going to hit these ranges from whatever barbell movement that we're kind of doing that day, if and when we are doing a barbell movement, but it's basically giving us some level of direction that we're taking the guesswork of just put more weight on the bar because I think a lot of the time that's not the answer. High school kids are going to develop no matter what we really throw at them, especially high school males, because this beautiful thing, which is the best performance enhancing drug that we have available to us, called puberty and
Mhm.
testosterone for that matter. Um, so being able to adapt programming off of that and not being married to it and giving kids like a voice from a readiness standpoint. Then in the future, what we're moving into is that Hawk and Dynamics is coming out with what they call a true strength device, that will be kind of like a multi-sensored system. So you can pull on it, you can push on it, you can do like an isometric thigh pull. specifically like in the baseball realm, like we'll do the ASH test, which is basically a student athlete will be laying on their stomach. Yep. 45-degree angle up, they're pushing into it. And I know if they're not within 10% of their kind of normal standard deviation range, hey, like maybe they're not recovering. Hey, we need probably take more focus to the recovery standpoint, whether it's if they're a starting pitcher, all right, let's nurse with a couple more like zone 2 runs, or bike rides, like a little bit lower level, a little less or a little bit more extensive, a little less intensive work, to allow their bodies to bounce back, and then testing that on a consistent basis as well, because the human body can change a lot in 12 to 16 to 24 hours. So being able to like adapt programming off of that, where and then in turn finding what works for the kid the best, because sure, like we can do body tempering, for example. Not every single kid is going to take to body tempering well. Maybe they are, hey, these guys need floss banding, and if they're game day -1 or start day -1, if they're a starting pitcher, like hey, this is what our protocol kind of looks like. So we're building or in the process of kind of building profiles with those kids that I'm constantly kind of like taking notes like, hey, this worked, hey, this didn't work. And then being able to have an open conversation with the kid that if we make it more consistent, we make that routine more consistent, one, they're going to mentally be more confident. And then two, hopefully the physical performance is matching that confidence as well.
Oh yeah. Well, and I like what you said there where you're like, hey, we're gonna develop, profiles that are basically saying, hey, like, did this work? Did this not work? But you're taking note of those things versus, not trying to bash anyone in particular, but like if you throw something on a marker board and every single one of your teams is doing the exact same thing, like probably not ideal. And you need to have, hyper individualization, maybe not, especially with the large amount of teams and everything you have, but you can have some microscopic level of individualization of like, okay, hey, instead of doing, a barbell movement, maybe we just do an isometric hold, but we're still getting some similar adaptation out of this that, you know, whether it's due to injury or based on what the readiness score is, you can still check a lot of boxes without having to basically throw them all under the same umbrella or put them at higher risk for injuries, which again, um, there's always that multi-sport versus sport specialization talk that everyone talks about. Um, but I think sometimes the guys who do have those multi-sport level, um, just toolboxes to go into, they're a lot more better just general movers versus guys who are hyper specialized and only do, in baseball, for example, only throw or only hit and rotate one way. They need a little bit more exposure to different, you know, solutions. I would like to call it, like, what other things can you do to try to solve this problem that's laid out in front of you, or a task, to be able to move and challenge themselves in a way they haven't been usually probably in their sport.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's like getting the kid, and I think I learned luckily early on in my career because of COVID, where I
Mm.
was at Davidson College as a strength coach, where we were on plywood platforms with nothing but 45-pound kettlebells, or actually 20-kilogram kettlebells, because they were cheaper to get and we could get them faster. The kids didn't know the difference. And bands. So I quickly realized, like, all right, maybe just some general physical preparedness, GPP, is probably what these kids need. And these were Division I athletes. So being able like to take that side of stuff, and that's kind of what's paid me well, like so far, like at the high school level, where we're giving the kids the avenue, but also we're not over coaching, because I think we can be very, very quick to over coach, where, oh yeah, your hands got to be at 45 degrees when you dumbbell bench press. Sure, like I like to say that like most of our guys probably dumbbell bench press at 45 degrees, but there may be some kids that are more comfortable and stronger at 30 degrees, or they're more comfortable and stronger at 60 degrees.
Mhm.
So like giving some level of not necessarily autonomy, so not a whole lot of like choice in the programming, but freedom within the movement that they're going to train at a more comfortable basis. And if there's something that, hey, this isn't working, or hey, coach, like this doesn't kind of like get me to the point where I want to be, or if they have some finger problems or some wrist problems, like that may adjust like a lot of stuff, and being able to like adapt off of that is important. But if I'm not forcing the kid into movements that they probably are, one, either not ready for, or two, like their bodies physically like can't do, like every single kid's going to squat differently.
Mm-hmm.
We can
Everyone.
be so quick to, yeah, we can be so quick to say like, hey, feet shoulder width apart, toes turned slightly out, like boom, go. That may work for 60% of your population, 70% of that population, but if their hip sockets are pointed more outwards, like maybe a wider stance, they're going to adapt off of that. So then taking note of that, letting them train within that, because that's all right. If we're focusing on strength development, you're going to want to put them in biomechanical positions that they're going to be stronger or develop more strength. And then being able to say, like, hey, like these warm up exercises, or like, hey, this prep work that we're giving our kids, like that'll kind of help us fill those gaps that you may not be getting because you move slightly differently. But then it's also just like some kids will take to different things better or not as well. So understanding like, hey, what stimuluses am I chasing,
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily the movements? Because to me, like if we have a kid that comes in with low back pain, maybe a barbell from a front rack or a back rack position isn't comfortable. But then if I put some dumbbells in his hand and have him do an ISO front squat, or sorry, ISO split squat, then he's going to be much more comfortable. And then we're probably actually going to help his low back pain too, which is kind of like the hacking of the program, the deeper level of the program, that we're going to help him balance his low back pain because we're going to put him in a quote unquote unilateral stance instead of bilateral. And we're not going to force him in positions. And we are still going to develop the quads. We are still going to develop the knees. Like we're going to develop the glutes, no matter what that really thing is, because the body isn't necessarily going to really know. I think people are too quick to just think of like muscles and single minded, when it's like if we look at the body globally instead of locally, we'd be much better off and much more complete from performance coaches. That every single person that you train, you're going to have to train slightly differently. The way you talk, the way you program, the way you maybe adapt, help them with the recovery stuff. And you have to take note of what works, because if you constantly circle, you're going to lose that trust. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so always just trying to find the answer that works best. Sure, you can have kind of like a general, like for the most part, like our programs are 80% alike across all of our sports, but that 20% can be a make or break scenario to a lot of kids and a lot of sports. And
Mm-hmm.
then in turn, where a lot of the freedom within the movements, freedom within the programming is really coming into play.
Oh, 100%. And, that's kind of the bone that I had to pick with me taking the CSCS, where they're saying, hey, you need to do cleans or you need to do all these movements, right? Like everyone has their own philosophy, but I'm like, hey, and especially in the baseball world, when I was growing up, everyone was like, don't do any overhead movements. And I think there was probably uh, a little too general too general of an absolute to say, hey, you should do nothing overhead. So I think I definitely lacked that, and that showed up in why I probably had some shoulder issues going on later
Yeah.
into my playing career, because I didn't strengthen a whole lot. So now, just being a general human, now I'm doing more stuff overhead because I knew that that's kind of a low hanging fruit for me. Um, but what's your take on guys? Let's say, we were talking about the squat or having just any type of overhead movement like a press or a clean for guys who may not have that full, overhead shoulder flexion range of motion, right? What are some easy go-to alternatives? So kind of going back to your whole point of saying, hey, we're not trying to fix the athlete to a specific movement, or, and any sport, you could say, hey, we're trying to fix them to a certain drill or look a certain way, right? Because like you said before, is the trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. What are some other ways on how you can get better overhead strength adaptations without having them throw a barbell over their head?
So I think when you start to look at the shoulder as one of the most complex body parts that we have, which baseball players can all agree to. I think when you start to understand where there's so much different training that can go on through the shoulder. Like we have, all right, four main rotator cuff muscles. We have the labrum, but then you also have, or what's their socket look like, what's their chromium process look like, are they closed, are they open? Because really, like, the human body, for the most part, I think I saw statistics when I was in grad school that, like, really only about 15% of people in the world actually have a shoulder that an overhead press is a natural motion for them for.
Mm. Mm.
So when we take that into account, where, hey, like, we're going to do different things from each other, some stuff's going to be comfortable, some stuff's not going to be comfortable, and that's even going back to, like, kind of like what I commented on, like the angles of the hand with a dumbbell bench press or incline or overhead press, like, that makes a difference because it's going to maybe isolate stuff that is more natural to just the skeletal system that you're dealing with, let alone the muscular system, et cetera, that you may be coming across. So, like, for me, like, there's much more than like barbell work. Like, I love landmine stuff. I think that puts kids, because it lets them be at an angle, which if we take the chest, move it down at an angle, and then we put up overhead, we're actually going to probably isolate probably through the front side of the shoulder a little bit more, because naturally, like, there's going to be some lean, because the beautiful thing called gravity, which I think people
Right.
don't really think about, but, like, the more that you start to think about how the adaptation of gravity and then in turn physics dictates a lot of the stuff that you do, I think you can be much, much better off. And where I think, like, Dan Cleather wrote Force, and then Force 2, which Force 2 is a speed biomechanics book. Those, like, that stuff matters. That stuff really, really matters. And I think strength and conditioning as a whole is moving in that direction that, all right, how do we produce force
Mm.
locally and globally? And it's not necessarily just maximal strength. It's like we're starting to move in a direction that how much you bench isn't really a thing as much anymore. It never really was in baseball, but really, like, across, like, all sports, like, it's moving in that direction. There's many more people that, hey, like, I'm going to expose kids to these forces at these angles that allow us to do what we do. I think Bobby Streep does a tremendous job,
Mm.
who's Patrick Mahomes' trainer. Like, that, I think, gave us as performance coaches an avenue that everything is so much outside the barbell. What are your eyes doing? What are your hands doing? What positions can you get your spine into? Because even, like, with baseball players, and Mahomes is the same way. Sometimes he's way up over the top. Sometimes he's way down low. Sometimes his head's connected to that throw, disconnected to that throw. Like, what are his hips doing? What are his feet doing? Like, that's all stuff that you got to expose kids to, because if we only hit off a machine that's throwing 88-mile-per-hour fastballs, then that's all you're ever going to hit.
Mhm.
It's the same thing with performance training. If I'm only training within these certain kind of constraints, I'm never going outside the box, then the kids are only ever going to be good at what I'm constraining them to. So I think, like, we're starting to take a turn in the right direction. But it's even like what I kind of alluded to earlier of looking globally, not locally. I think too much time you're like, oh, it's a shoulder press, or,
Mm.
oh, it's a bench press, which works the chest muscle. Sure, that's a fine way of thinking. I think people have certainly made careers thinking that way. You're like, all right, if I make this kid crawl, what's happening at the shoulder blade? Like, you don't really think of, like, a crawl position working the shoulder blade or, like, movement, but, like, a sideways crawl is really, really good at actually letting the shoulder blade kind of, like, glide and through, depending on the posture of the kid. So it's starting to think of, what movements can check the most boxes. It's all dependent on how much time you have, what equipment you have, everything else.
Oh
That's the
yeah.
skill of coaching. And that's what the CSCS and the Essentials of Strength and Conditioning textbook will never teach anyone,
Mhm.
is because if I walk into a room and all of a sudden I don't have barbells, like, half the people that just took a CSCS are probably going to, like, freak out.
Yeah,
which
right.
which
Yeah.
which was me. It was me. I think that, like, I'll never say it wasn't me. Like, I thought I knew it all until, I learned reflexive performance reset from a guy named Dan Fichter.
Mhm.
That was, like, my first, like, conference, like, post college, like, right after I took the CSCS. I walked in and I was like, listen to the first couple presenters. I was like, oh, those guys, like, they're just talking about, like, basic stuff. And then all of a sudden, like post lunch, we go into this RPR discussion that Dan Fichter is talking about like eye movement and like laser pointers and like the reflex system and everything else. I was like, wow, like I know nothing. And then a couple months later, I saw my first Tendo unit. And then from there, like I was just like, there's so much more to the human body than just the X's and O's that, hey, if you want to train hypertrophy, it's 8 to 12 reps.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Like you think you know a whole lot, especially coming off the high of like studying for that test for some guys. And then or any sport, whatever you think you have, right? And then all of a sudden you get exposed to guys like that and you're just like, "Okay, yeah, I got a lot more to learn. We're going to be down here and now I'm going to be kind of riding that roller coaster back and forth of learning more, staying adaptable, and having a growth mindset. I think is the best way to go about it. Um, but no, yeah, I love that. Um, I kind of want to dive a little bit more deeper on like what you were talking about of like bear crawls or like I talk and say it's more like a locomotion patterning. And I was exposed to, I'm sure you may or may not have heard of this, but Ido Portal is a really big like
Mm.
mixed martial artist guy, but he was kind of one of the first ones that I was introduced to from a former guy I used to coach. Um, and he was like, "Hey, you need to go check this guy out. There's a disciple of his like in Miami." So I went there, and we didn't, it's just a big open room. And he was like, "Okay, hey, we're gonna play a game where you're starting in a bear crawl position. You're gonna take one of your limbs, and now that limb has to be closest to the wall that was basically to my right." And I was like, "Okay." He's like, "But you have to move in a very smooth, slow transition to get there versus like just throwing it around there, right?" It's like you see that a lot in a lot of athletic movements where guys can move very fluidly or very rigid and like just jerky movements, right? So it kind of was like a huge almost paradigm shift for me. I was like, "Oh, okay, like this is kind of more of what, it's very dumbed down, but more of like, okay, I need to learn how to transition through things because you can do certain movements in a squat or, a deadlift, whatever, and get very one dimensional. But if you can't learn how to transition and move, right, like a Patrick Mahomes, for example, like if he couldn't move around and he was only moving forward and backwards the whole time, kind of like the old school video games, right? They're only able to move like this, then you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot because you need to have a whole lot more options where you can be a lot more dynamic and have a little bit more of a bob and weave movement versus just left, right, forward, backwards, you know.
Yeah, I think there's like functional movement skills has been like catching a lot of ground, like how we bend, how we back bend, which at one point, like I was in the thought, like the Stu McGill, like back mechanic, like I just
Mhm.
read back mechanic. I'm like, we got to keep everything rigid as possible. Like
Right.
we got a dead bug and curl up and like just do that, which sure, like that's still good stuff. And like we will absolutely still dead bug and bird dog and side plank
Oh
and
yeah, it's definitely good
do
stuff.
all of those things.
Yeah.
But it's like, okay, how can I teach a kid where I think rhythm is like the term that I think of like the most of how can we do everything in rhythm? Because if I teach a kid like, all right, we're gonna feel this ball like off of this foot, then you're gonna throw like cross body here, and they're not doing it in like a herky jerky motion, like then we're making progress athletically, which I think is like where some of that level of GPP training is important
Mhm.
where a lot of kids aren't getting that. Like I was lucky enough, like I grew up in the middle of nowhere in New Jersey. I spent most of my summers cutting firewood to be able to heat our houses in the winter. But
Mhm.
I was picking up that log, bringing it up to a table, taking like this split wood, throwing this into the truck here. And I'm not saying like I was the best athlete in the world, but there's a lot of kids that are missing that side of stuff because they're just not exposed to it. Like they're not working manual labor when you're 12, 13 years old. COVID created those scenarios that like I mean when we came back from COVID, I had kids that didn't even know how to skip. Like that's one of the basic like motor development patterns that we're just missing out on.
Mhm.
So when you take all that into account and you're like looking at your program as a whole, what can the kids, like, what do the kids need to get better on? Like for us, like at Charlotte Christian, like I looked at our baseball guys after like first couple weeks. I'm like, most of these guys like spines just
They don't.
don't move the way that I want them to. And
Mhm.
it's not necessarily like, all right, let's overhaul everything, but let's create fluidity. So fluidity and rhythm in the motions, then we're going to be better off. And then in turn, like how does that connect to the brain? Like the temporal patterning that goes into all of that, which is where Mahomes is so crazy athletic, is like what he's able to do from a patterning standpoint where, oh yeah, like people are thinking that he's throwing a no look pass. He's not throwing a no look pass. His head's just staying stable enough that it almost looks like he's looking another way, but his eyes are set on a target that's somewhere else, and he's able to like connect that with the body. We start to like look at like how he trains and the vector system that's been created of that, of like, all right, we're going to keep this foot forward, but then we're going to turn 170 degrees open, then perform a lunge or a squat, or like that's all stuff that's really really important and kids need to do earlier on, which is why I'm like excited to get a little bit more of a grasp from our sixth, seventh, and eighth graders. It's that way by the time that they get to high school, I'm like, hey, you move well enough. Now let's make you strong in those movements. Let's make you jump high, run fast. But like tumbling, for example, like kids aren't used to the ground.
Mm.
Like we had a track runner who is, I mean, one of the best in the country. He tripped during a race and broke his wrist. Could tumbling have helped him with that? Could him knowing how to act and react in the ground help him with that? It could have. Sure, there's certainly scenarios that you break a bone or roll your ankle that like is in
Right.
no way your
Accident.
fault. Like you're
Yeah.
gonna at some point you're gonna be exposed to something that your body was not ready for. But that's also like if I'm exposing kids to high forces where a depth drop or like a depth drop to a staggered stance or like giving forces or training on different levels of the force velocity curve, then hopefully I'm going to keep my kids healthier. So I think that's where the dynamic that we're doing from a recovery standpoint, from a warm up standpoint, from a prep time standpoint, is just trying to train much more globally than we ever do locally. Like, sure, like we look at a black burn, for example, like everyone knows that's a posterior shoulder exercise.
Mhm.
Like I feel it a lot in my trap, which I have a bad neck, which is a story for another day. But like I feel that a lot in my trap. But like some kids may get like posterior delt, some kids may like look at like the tricep, and
Yeah.
people are so quick to throw stuff out like when it like doesn't work, but maybe like the kids, maybe because their shoulder capsule is built different or like everything else, like every single person's going to feel that slightly differently. It doesn't make it a bad movement. But if we start to look at, all right, if I'm just doing this movement and not necessarily just working this muscle, then I'm going to be able to progress over time.
Oh yeah. No, I love that. And the yeah, I guess just it kind of does start in the mind a little bit too, right? Like I talk about being mentally present, being mentally in the zone. Like whenever you give guys or any athlete really like more of the ability to kind of move and transition in more fluid ways, they're going to be able to solve some problems on their own, right? Versus them being able to, for example, you were saying like being able to get up off the ground. Like I literally had some kids start in like a 99 position for warm up, and I'm like, all right, hey, get up off the ground, show me what you got. And some of them didn't even know how to get up off the ground, So it's um, definitely interesting to see. And I had a previous episode here, I think it was episode 12 with Dr. Ishmael Gallo. He does like baseball flows. I'm sure you may have seen that. But he was kind of one who just kind of gave me a language for that. It was like, hey, like they're missing a global pattern system or GPS as he calls it, for them to even be able to have that. And I think he got a lot of his stuff from I think it was just can't think of the exact term, but basically like how babies are transitioning um from being able to crawl to walk, and then once people walk, now they're not hanging out on the ground anymore. So, you know, exposing them to that, you know, or even looking back, I think the best thing my parents ever did was put me in a gymnastics class to learn how to tumble and do all of that stuff. So, I think it's definitely something that's missing for sure. Even guys that, I give them an example of a warm up. I'm like, hey, do a cartwheel. And they're like, what? What's a cartwheel? I'm like, oh, hey, well,
Yeah.
here's an example of one. Try to do your best. Don't let your feet slam on the ground, right? Like smooth transitions, like what we were talking about before. But if you're able to do that, it's a lot easier to help them build strength in certain different ranges of motion, like you were talking about.
Yeah.
So how for you, whenever you're going from, transitioning more away from the barbell movements to just having more, maybe from the ground up, like literally, right? Like what's a good example of that? I guess for the listeners to kind of conceptualize this a little bit more, to then transitioning to being more athletic movement based, or maybe more skill sport specific.
I mean, like if we look at from the ground up, for example, which I think is a good, and certainly I've given like a bunch of like presentations and like alluded to this in a lot of different ways. When you start to look at, all right, stance first, what movement are we trying to create and what stance are we doing it out of? I think like the more time where the feet are the only constant connection with the ground, whether they're in sneakers or with not, like I much rather our kids lift in socks, or in like I
Oh,
know like
100%.
couple of our baseball guys have the Vivos, which are good as well for a barefoot shoe example. Okay, like if I'm deeper into a split and then I'm having requirement of balance on that, and then I'm pressing up overhead, like all right, that's much more of a global movement than if my feet were underneath me and I'm using motivation there in order to like kind of like make that happen. Um, I think swings are a big part of our baseball program. We do pistol grip kettlebell swings. We'll do double-handed kettlebell swings. We'll do a dumbbell high swing, like cross body chopping movements. Looking at, I think, and this is where my mind goes a lot of the time, is looking at striations of muscles where, hey, like this muscle does this, and if this is completely overloaded, how am I contrasting that in our program? So like right now, like we have some level of rotational work in our baseball programming, but where a baseball swing or a baseball throw is very external oblique dominant, our chop series is working our internal obliques. Or, hey, like I'm going to do a suitcase carry, but sure, the suitcase carry is going to train my transverse abdominis, but it's also going to have some level of deloading of the shoulder. So I think like giving that level of freedom, hand angles, shoulder angles, feet angles, like that's all a major part of it. And understanding kids biomechanically is certainly like a skill in that, where understanding like the fix like right off the bat. But if I'm looking at my program as a whole, we start stance first, and then in turn, how am I contrasting all of that? Where, all right, so we're quad dominant with a dumbbell reverse lunge, or if if I want to check more boxes, a heavy loaded goblet reverse lunge is just going to check slightly more boxes, because if I need to hold a heavy weight in a goblet loaded or a Zercher position, for example, then I'm going to be a little bit more challenged globally than just like locally if I have two dumbbells down my side, or contralateral or ipsilateral loading, et cetera, et cetera. But okay, so if I'm doing a dumbbell reverse lunge, goblet loaded, then what am I supersetting with? Because I think supersetting, especially for people that may be working with team base where you can't have a whole lot of standing around, like you may only have a certain amount of equipment, like we superset everything. Okay, so we're quad dominant with a reverse lunge. All right, what's the opposite of that? Well, that's the hamstring. What's the balance? Okay. If I'm training a reverse lunge, I'm training the quad to be kind of going through flexion extension. All right. So then if I'm looking at the hamstring, we kind of already know, like, all right, so you're contrasting with flexion extension on the opposite side. Can I train the hamstring isometrically, eccentrically, et cetera, et cetera? So I think like that's the nitty gritty of our programming, is that everything is contrasted. For an example of constant exposure of the force velocity curve, where all right, so an isometric split squat. So if that's our primary movement, isometric split squat, then I would contrast with something like a straight leg bound where I have high velocity hamstring contacts. Okay,
Mm,
isometric split squat is very quad loaded, patellar tendon loaded. All right, I'm going to contrast that with high velocity hamstring contacts. And then, all right, then I'm going to do a glute loaded exercise, probably flexion extension. There's plenty of glute bridge variations. And then in turn, like what angle of the glute am I working? Maybe it's an expand walk or a monster walk, depending on like what access you have to. And then, what's the last exercise that I pair with that? Usually it's probably, especially in season, it's a mobility exercise,
mhm.
like the lateral hip in that kind of superset, for example. The lateral hip would probably be something I want to mobilize. And then if I'm working with baseball players, especially, like the lateral hips are going to take a lot of contact. Like you got to, whether it's a bench pigeon stretch, elevated pigeon, we'll do some level of band distracted work. So then, like, I digress this long tangent that I'm on right now. When you start to look at contrasting the body and contrasting the training and checking boxes and not just putting yourself in a box,
Yeah.
like you can have hopefully some healthier athletes and definitely some high performing ones as well.
Oh,
It's
100%.
fine.
Yeah, and you're not leaving any stone unturned there either. It's not like, oh, hey, we can only do heavy movements with the barbell, so you do like a, squat or a lunge with an RDL. Like, okay, well then where's the rest of the strength velocity curve being exposed to on that, especially whenever guys are being more game like, more game speed. Like that might be a time and place for the off season, or if that's something that you haven't done in a while, like you could throw that in there, right? And be like, hey, like let's see how we adapt to this. But whenever they're only doing one specific thing and they're not having that contrast, they're going to develop a weakness in a way, right? Like whether it's self-inflicted or not, or like us as our programming, right? Like we don't want to narrow kids down to where they're overly strong in one thing and they have this massive weak link that's exposing them maybe to have lack of better performance, or even hopefully not, but having a risk for injury, right? So
Yeah, I mean the body is always going to attack the weakest links,
mm,
and that's where being proactive in programming rather than reactive, and this is where like having some level of experience from a rehab component where I worked in orthopedic surgery, I worked in physical therapy as well. Like I don't want our kids to get to that point because the body is going to always, always, always attack what is weakest. If you have a slip disc or you got some flaring in your labrum, like you're going to feel that pain because your body is going to bring that up.
mhm.
So then in turn, it's the same thing with movement. Like if I do not move well, at some point, karma is going to get you and you're going to be exposed to it. And hopefully that's not in the biggest moment of your career because your body just can't get there, for example. Or you get to a point where, you're 20 years old and you're 1 year away from being drafted or like signing a contract, et cetera, et cetera. And now all of a sudden, like you need to do a complete mechanical overhaul because your body's not going to sustain itself. Like, but then if you haven't been exposed to it, like it's going to feel super unnatural and your body's going to attack those weak points. So then it's like this, it's kind of coming full circle here. Like it's the same thing with our like recovery standpoint for like our starting pitchers, for example, like what works for them.
Mhm.
Like every single kid's going to throw differently. Like I was a kid who fought bicep tendonitis a lot because I was a catcher. Like a lot of catchers will fight that pretty often. But hey, we got some dudes that get some forearm tightness. We get some dudes that get rhomboid tightness. And we got some dudes that, hey, I know their triceps are going to lock up, and the only way I can get their posterior shoulder to really let go is if I get their tricep unlocked. So it's like finding that balance in that you got to steal from a lot of different places and not letting yourself get into the scenarios that every single thing is going to work perfectly. Sure, like you always want to train, you want to train that applies for everyone. To me, I want to train my best kids to be the best kids and be exposed to as much. Because if I raise my top side, and this is the same thing in my speed training components, like if I expose kids to the highest velocities, the highest levels of stimulus, then like everything else will come easier. And that's kind of been the dynamic that I've taken from a performance standpoint and hopefully have kind of like the results to show for it.
Oh, 100%. Well, and not to mention too, like again, because you're having to deal with so many athletes, like you just getting them faster and more conditioned is going to help them in so much more capacity outside of, being a little bit more skill specific. Like if you're able to run or you're quick and you're moving well from, position to position or from wherever the ball is to wherever you need to be, you're going to have a lot more opportunities to play because coaches, the old school way was like, hey, does he pass the eye test? Can he actually move fluidly and being able to not look like he's laboring to do something, right? Whatever skill it is, whether it's throwing a baseball or tracking down a fly ball or, you know, in a field sport, anything as far as like trying to get one side of the field to the other. If they can't do that very well, then it's, like you said, the body's going to fight itself and continue to basically just keep hitting that roadblock over and over until something gives, right? Um, for kind of going off your topic with the injuries there, I know the more I'm around, just coaching and other coaches, it's really awesome to see how some guys can adapt to guys certain injuries that might be coming about. Like how would you go about, okay, hey, like this guy, and I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on this. There's a lot of guys, especially in the middle school level, that are having a lot more growth plate issues. Obviously, we're no doctors or anything like that, but what would be some things outside of like, overuse of them playing all the time and throwing more frequently? How would you reduce that exposure of, the possibility of having growth plate injuries? If, and again, it sounds very isolated in the question, but, for something similar to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really interesting question. And once again, not a doctor,
For
have
sure.
seen like my fair share of injuries and certainly had my fair share of injuries as well. I think a lot of it alludes to that GPP component that, these kids aren't climbing trees, they're not rolling on the ground, they're not falling from high distances. Like I remember like I used to like stand like we used to jump off roofs onto trampolines and flip
Yeah.
here and like do that like and we probably had a lot less broken bones, a lot less ACL tears and like everything else. Like we are constantly trying to expose kids to more forces from different angles, from different heights, from different speeds, et cetera, then hopefully we're going to give them an avenue that the body is going to withstand itself. Because the strongest bones in general are the ones that have been acted upon the most. So like if I'm constantly giving tension, and this is where like eccentric and isometric based training has done well and like has been shown to keep kids healthy and make people healthy and then make them better movers off of that, then it's going to be hopefully like much, much better off. Um, and then it's just like, I hate to say it, the American diet is absolutely terrible in
Mm.
a lot of those micronutrients. Um, so we look at like whenever I start with a client, for example, a lot of the conversations are, all right, like what are we doing from a nutrition standpoint? What are we doing from specifically a micronutrient standpoint? Because I know like the day I started taking magnesium before I went to bed, one, I started sleeping better, and then two, I was fighting a lot less like muscle tightness there throughout the day. The more I research it, the more I realize like, how poor the American diet is in getting a lot of those things. So I think there's probably something like that that is being overlooked as simple as We're sugar addicts, we're caffeine addicts, and then what does that do to the human body? I would like to put our middle school baseball team in Europe for 4 years and then compare numbers on if we have growth plate injuries over there because maybe it's a diet or sleep based or micronutrient problem. Um, maybe we can start a
Yeah.
research study with that.
Hey, that'd be cool. Just send them over there and see what they got going on. I mean, I hear it all countless times. My fiance, she's a flight attendant. She's like, "Oh, the food's so much better over there," and I'm like, "All right, well, I guess I got to try this out, right?" And I'm with you on that. Even at a young age, my parents were always trying to give me, you know, whether it was a multivitamin or something to kind of help promote that because they knew that the nutrition, and especially growing up in the South, like everything's fried, right? Like you got a little bit too much of exposure of certain things. So being able to kind of combat that, and even now as we get older, it's like, hey, it's not necessarily so much about the training, it's more of what you're putting into your body and how your body's going to respond to that. Like you said, to your point about magnesium, or for me, like, having way too much sugar is probably going to deplete my energy levels. I'm going to come down on a crash at some point, right? Like, you know, but it shouldn't be any different just because they're younger. Uh, there's a lot of other things that they need to perform well. And again, they need to enjoy being a kid, but at the same time, like you can't overdo it, right? Because too much of one thing is never good.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah, I feel like we could continue to talk over and over on several different topics, Kyle, but I really appreciate your time and coming on. But before I let you go, what are some ways guys can reach out to you if they're, just want to ask questions, or maybe they're trying to see if they can train with you? What are the best ways for them to reach out?
Yeah, so both my social media handles are at KYLEJACKSIC. I always want to say Twitter, but I guess it's X now. We'll,
Right.
we'll still
Yeah,
I still say I'm sending a tweet example. Um, so those are the best ways to kind of like get in contact with me. And then my LLC performance training is Jax JAX athleticperformance.com. Those are all linked on my social media profiles. But yeah, like whatever coaches, like whatever questions like they have, I present kind of like all around the country, and like a lot of content will kind of be coming out over the next couple months, which I'm like really looking forward to. But my door is always open if you're local to the Charlotte area. And then like however I can help kind of move the needle forward, for
100%.
whether it's a coach, student athlete, parent, because I think that's a whole other world too, is how we can educate our parents better.
No
Um,
doubt.
what I'm looking forward to kind of building at Charlotte Christian. But yeah, those are all the best ways for me.
Love it, love it. And you have an internship, I think, that I saw where that's being opened up for you guys too, right?
Yep. Yep. So currently
Yeah.
accepting summer interns. So we've been able to produce. So North Carolina was way behind the times in full-time strength and conditioning coaches. Now there's 7 at a public school level. 4 of them are my former interns, which is really, really exciting because we've shown a lot of growth, and we take a different dynamic to our internship that it's going to be super, super hands-on, and that I'm going to expect you to coach and like know a lot of things. And then I'm going to expect you to fail over and over. But the fun part of dealing with the Toyota Camrys is that you're allowed to fail over and over, and you're not going to get fired from your job right off the bat. So it's a really good place to learn. And I always enjoy kind of bringing some people in, that they make me better as a coach as well, because they bring in different exposures, different dynamics, like, or they ask really, really good questions that make me question every single thing that I do, which is going to make us all better in the long run.
100%. Iron sharpens iron, right? You got to be able
Yep.
to be thrown in the fire and learn how to coach. You can't just read it in a book. And asking questions, even better questions, over time helps you learn, right? Not just taking, oh, this is the way we've always done it as an answer. So love it. Well, appreciate you all listening in. Thanks so much. If you got anything out of this episode, please share it and stay in the zone.